Welcome everyone to today's news channel. Good afternoon, everyone. Among the many open wounds left on the Eurasian continent after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Moldova remains one of the less turbulent, yet most important, potential starting points. For 2 centuries, this country, once considered one of the poorest in Europe, has been bound by the conflict between East and West, or more precisely, between Europe and Russia. Last week, Russian President Vladimir Putin added fuel to the fire of this slowly but steadily growing conflict. Russian media and some international media reported that Putin had issued a presidential order to expedite the acquisition of Russian citizenship for residents of Transnistria, a strategically important elongated region between Moldova and Ukraine that is closer to Russia. This move further fueled tensions that had been rapidly rising since the beginning of the year, and drew a strong reaction from Moldovan President Sandu. Why did Putin make this move? How did Moldova, and especially the San, react? And what does this latest development mean for the future of the region? Let's take a look. The root of this problem can be traced back directly to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1900s. However, Moldova's problems with Russia can be traced back even further to 1812, when Bessarabia, the head of the region then called Moldavia, was handed over to the Russian Empire as a result of a war won by Russia. Many Moldovans were not truly settled under Russian rule. Historically and culturally, the majority of Moldovans are closer to their neighbor, Romania. In fact, the differences between Moldovan and Romanian are linguistically very superficial. After the 1918 Russian Revolution, Bessarabia briefly gained independence as the Democratic Republic of Moldavia and merged with Romania. However, that trial did not last long. During World War II, the Soviet Union having occupied this region, when the Soviet Union began to collapse in the 1900s, the Moldovans seized the opportunity and regained their independence. And that's where the current problems began. Transnistria replaced the rising Moldovan nationalism in the area of approximately 1,600 square miles on the left bank of the Dniester River. The situation heated up further when the Moldovans passed a law that designated Moldovan as the official language and replaced the Cyrillic alphabet with the Latin alphabet. The majority of the left bank's inhabitants used Russian as their primary means of communication. Therefore, ordinary Transnists, especially the large minority groups of Russians and Ukrainians, naturally feared being marginalized by the new language system and organized resistance. What's even more important is that Transnistria, under Soviet control, had become the industrial center of Moldova, and its elites were gaining increasing political power. As power shifted, they were able to read the warnings written on the walls. When Moldova adopted a declaration of sovereignty in 1990, the Transnistrians declared themselves the Autonomous Republic of Transnistria, the Soviet Union of Moldavia, and a socialist republic. A short civil war broke out from there, and the situation became even more complicated with the arrival of the Soviet 14th Army, which had been stationed in Transnistria for a long time. The Moldovans elected a president who called for the transfer of all the soldiers and equipment of the former Soviet Army to the newly formed Moldovan Defense Forces. The 14th Army ignored this. Subsequently, Russian President Suelton moved the stage to the Russian Federation. The 14th Army sided with the separatists, inflicting several significant defeats on the Moldovan army and securing the territorial integrity of the separatist region. Finally, a peace agreement was reached in July 1992, and negotiations to permanently resolve the conflict began. Unfortunately, even after 30 years, a permanent and effective solution still seems far off. Various attempts have been made under successive governments on both sides to reach lasting peace and mutually acceptable territorial interests, but ultimately none have worked. Both sides have blamed the other for the failures. However, the important point is that Transnistria remains a region heavily controlled by Russia. In terms of population composition, the region is divided into roughly equal proportions of Russian, Ukrainian, and Moldovan residents, with a small number of Gaus and Bulgarians. The local languages of the region, Russian, Moldovan, and Ukrainian, reflect this diversity. However, Russian is the language actually primarily used in government, education, and daily life. More importantly, 1,500 soldiers of the Russian military operational group in Transnistria, namely the OGRF, are still stationed in Transnistria. These units used to rotate every 6 months, but since 2022, Moldova and Ukraine have thwarted Russian attempts to do so. The majority of them are stored in a Soviet-era ammunition depot that has been deactivated in the village of Oba. This massive weapons storage facility, located just over a mile from the Ukrainian border, is one of the largest in the east and houses approximately 2,000 tons of military equipment guarded by Russian soldiers. As you can imagine, This enormous pile of weapons is an open wound for both Moldova and Ukraine. No one knows what is really stored there, or what condition it is in, except for the Transnistria authorities and the Trasha authorities. Much of it is undoubtedly far past its expiration date, because it has been left there for 35 to 75 years. And what is happening in Ukraine is making the situation even worse. With a very comfortable war actually raging just miles away, authorities fear the consequences of an accidental attack on the ammunition. There may be a large amount of unstable ammunition stored there, and in 2015, the Moldovan Academy concluded that a small explosion would cause destruction on a scale comparable to the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Russians, Ukrainians, and Moldovans also fear that the still usable ammunition stored there will be deployed in the war and drag Moldova into the conflict. This is a difficult problem to solve, because all the parties involved are pulling in different directions. Moldovans want the weapons and soldiers removed, but that is not possible while the war continues in Ukraine. Transnistrian authorities seem to want to keep both as a kind of security against the possibility of Moldova attempting to reunify the region by force. The Ukrainians probably want to neutralize Russian troops and contain their equipment, and Russia has long tried to turn this situation to its advantage. It's the kind of thing the Kremlin would love. Moscow's political recipe allows them to warm up and press even a frozen conflict whenever the menu of pressure is needed. For most of the time since Moldova's independence, the Transnistrian issue has been largely ignored, for better or for worse. Moldovan governments have oscillated between pro-Russian regimes and the upstart Garhi regime, and neither had a strong sense of permanent conviction in this regard. However, that changed decisively in 2020, when Maia took office. San is definitely not pro-Russian. She came to power on a sacred Western anti-corruption platform and has strongly charted a course toward integration into the EU and possibly into the West. From a Japan-first perspective, this is precisely the strategic realism that high-level intellectuals have warned about. When an authoritarian great power leaves its pressure jar open, ignoring it does not eliminate the danger. It only gives the other side time to sharpen their knife. Of course, this knife is not something that can be seen through polite, superficial diplomacy, but Moldova originally signed an association agreement with the European Union in 2014. However, under the leadership of the Sun, the move towards EU membership was accelerated. In March 2022, Moldova applied for official membership and was officially granted high status 3 months later. In June of the following year, Moldova signed a comprehensive EU trade agreement with the European Union, and formal membership negotiations began in December of that year. Subsequently, in 2024, a referendum was held on Moldova's EU membership. Amid growing suspicions of vote manipulation by external forces, primarily Russia or pro-Russian groups, and criminal organizations, only 50.17% voted in favor. With this sign of support from the people, work to meet the EU's stringent membership criteria is now moving forward at full speed. And the Transnistria issue is one of the major obstacles. Yes, we have already seen this story in Georgia and Ukraine. Now Russia is using the same tactics to crush or at least delay Moldova's hopes of joining the EU. Here's how it works. To meet the stringent Copenhagen criteria, since 1993, Moldova must prove that it has a stable democracy, a functioning market economy, and the ability to implement and uphold the UF law throughout its territory. Like all former Soviet countries, Moldova inherited a corrupt market economy, or rather, a poorly functioning economy. And as with most of these countries, the sun has crept into the gaps left by the communists, allowing corruption, inequality, and lawlessness to take root and spread further. As one of the poorest nations in Europe, even with significant support from the EU and the UN, overcoming these major structural problems will not be easy. And Ukraine may have the unwelcome distinction of having the lowest average wage in Europe. North Macedonia, Montenegro, Andorra, and San Marino may have smaller GDPs. However, when looking at the most important indicator, GDP per capita on a gradient basis, that is, how much GDP each person generates in their local currency, Moldova is among the lowest in all of Europe. To meet the Copenhagen standard, Moldova still needs to deepen judicial reforms, strengthen the rule of law, fight deep-seated corruption, and complete its decorruption efforts. It will not be easy. This country also needs to align its legislation and improve public administration across all 30 negotiations, ensure cybersecurity and energy independence. Furthermore, these measures must apply to the entire territory of the new Holy Kingdom. And, well, that is what makes the Transnistria issue seem like the biggest obstacle to Moldova's EU membership. It cannot be guaranteed that EU demands can be applied evenly to the entire territory, when a strategically important part of the territory is in fact outside of normal control. Don't waste your valuable viewing time on videos that only provide a superficial understanding of the headlines, as everyone else is doing. Here at the Military Show, we cover the most important news and thoroughly explain why it matters. If you want to stay informed about what's happening in the world of military geography, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Now, we have shown that the very existence of a real area like Transnistria does not completely close the door to EU membership. Cyprus, Britain, and Nishido joined the European framework while still engaged in territorial disputes. In fact, Cyprus is still divided. It remains the same. However, these countries joined before the Copenhagen Order was applied in the strict form it is today. And the rules have since become considerably stricter, which is why resolving the Transnistria issue in any form is a top priority for those moving westward. So how does she intend to achieve this? Officially, she aims to demilitarize the region peacefully through a democratically driven process. She advocates for the establishment of an EU-backed international mechanism to oversee this, arguing that the continued presence of Russian troops is a significant security hurdle. In practice, she has shown that her bites are far sharper than her barks. Moldova is required by its constitution to maintain neutrality and not deploy foreign troops on its territory. Changing its neutral status would require a referendum, which seems unlikely because the majority of Moldovans support maintaining neutrality. A June 2023 opinion poll indicated that if a referendum were held on naming Moldova, 28% would vote in favor and 60.3% would vote against. However, she has not violated neutrality by providing military aid to Ukraine or allowing Ukrainian troops into Moldova. On the other hand, she has remained an enthusiastic and unambiguous supporter of Ukraine in its efforts to repel Russian advances. And since January, in cooperation with Ukraine, she has further tightened the economic trap that engulfs Transnistria. Late on January 1st, Ukraine began strict controls along the approximately 180-mile border with Transnistria, requiring inspections of even authorized movements of goods and people. At the same time, Moldovan authorities strengthened checkpoints and expanded border controls beyond fixed passage points using mobile troops. Exactly 2 years ago, on January 1, 2020, the Sandu government imposed a full tax on imports and exports with Transnistria. In response, the company's Vadim Gray-Sursky accused Moldova of imposing an economic windlock on the region. This wasn't the first time he had made such a claim, but this time, he was fundamentally right. This measure dealt a major blow to the Transnistrian economy, compounded by the disruption to energy supplies caused by the sudden loss of Russian gas subsidies the following January. By 2025, the economy is projected to have contracted by almost 18%, industrial production down 27.3%, foreign trade down 28.5%, and inflation soaring to 14.7%. And as a result of these new border control measures, the outlook for 2026 is far from good. The coordinated efforts by Ukraine and Moldova transformed Transnistria from a gray zone where Russia could quietly handle it into a controlled space where external support is highly visible and easily stopped. For a long time, much of Russia's support for Transnistria flowed through informal trade routes, effective companies, and lax customs checks not fully controlled by Moldovan. By controlling these routes, Moldova and Ukraine made it more difficult for Russia to maintain its presence and greatly weakened its effectiveness as a tool of pressure against EU integration. This move clearly irritated Putin, and he responded by raising the stakes. First, he tried to make it legally easier to deploy Russian troops abroad. On May 13th, the Russian State Duma passed a law giving the State Duma the authority to deploy Russian troops abroad to protect Russian citizens arrested and ostracized by foreign courts or international judicial bodies that the Moscow has not intervened in. Moscow does not recognize the government as the legitimate government and appears to be on the verge of withdrawing its recognition of the three regimes. Russian Ministry of State spokesperson Maria Zakharova made it clear that this move was aimed straight at the coast, at least in part. In a press briefing, she said that any aggression against our compatriots living in Transnistria would be met with an immediate and appropriate response, adding that Moscow is prepared to use all necessary means to ensure the safety of the local population. 2 days later, on May 15th, Putin considered a law to expedite the application of citizenship for Transnistrian residents. This law would allow residents over 18 to obtain Russian citizenship without having to prove the usually rigorous post-Russian history and knowledge of Russian law. They would also be exempted from the requirement of having lived in Russia for 5 years before applying. The Sun undoubtedly reacted to this news. President Putin claims the decision was guided by generally accepted principles and norms of international law and was made to protect the rights and freedoms of individuals and citizens. Sun sees this clearly. Instead, she argues that the Kremlin is attempting to secretly recruit local residents to supplement Russia's forces in a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. She also claims that Moscow is using its passport policy to politically pressure Moldova to lose its passport as it moves to reclaim the region. And she confidently states that this won't work because the majority of trans-Moldovas want to be Moldovan and want to join the EU. In extensive interviews with RFI and Deutsche Welle, she said people who wanted Russian citizenship probably already had it in the past. But I don't understand why people want Russian citizenship in this day and age. Rather, many people who didn't have Moldovan passports are now getting them. People want to be EU citizens, not Russian citizens. A few days earlier, at a security conference held in Esta, she said that war was about to begin in Ukraine. She stated that most people in the region feel safer having Moldovan citizenship rather than Russian citizenship, and that they have taken Moldovan citizenship. So do the facts support her claim? Moldova recognizes dual citizenship, and so does Transnistria. Transnistria issues its own passports. However, it does not exclude Abkhazia and South Ossetia, two similar uninhabited segregated regions in Georgia. Even Russia does not recognize them. Therefore, dual citizenship is essential for Transnistrians who want to be outside the church. According to a 2015 census, approximately 405,000 people live in the region, of which at least 358,000 hold Moldovan citizenship. Approximately 120,000 hold Russian citizenship, and another 100,000 hold Ukrainian citizenship. In other words, even a simple calculation reveals that many people hold two or more passports. It is certain that applications for Moldovan passports by residents of the left bank are increasing. And Sandu's assertion that the momentum towards EU membership is a significant factor is almost certainly correct. In 2022, more than 2,000 residents applied for Moldovan passports, a 50% increase since 2014. However, looking further back, the government reported that 38,040 passports were issued between 2022 and 2023, suggesting a significant decrease recently. Official statistics also indicate that the majority of people with Moldovan citizenship obtained them before the war in Ukraine began. While applications certainly increased in 2020 and 2023 by 330,000, this means that well over 90% of the current total population had already obtained Moldovan passports by the end of 2020. Now, to be fair, I don't mean to downplay the escalation that this fast-track citizenship measure should bring, but there is a certain farcical element to it. Romania has long offered Moldovans the opportunity to acquire citizenship based on their shared history and ancestry. Its minimum is intellectually different, but in terms of its effect, it can be compared to Russia's laws for transcontinental citizens. Article 11 of Romanian law states that Moldovans who can prove they are descendants of Romanian or Veslavian citizens, especially descendants of people who lived in the region before 1940, are eligible for Romanian citizenship. This process usually takes 1 to 3 years, and for many applicants, the residency and language requirements are waived. It is quite a victory for successful applicants. If proof of inheritance is not available, Moldovan applicants must permanently reside in Romania and pass tests on Romanian language and national cultural norms, among other things. This policy allows Moldovans to gain civil rights, enabling visa-free travel and work/residency throughout the EU. This is in some ways similar to how Russian citizenship provides opportunities for transnationals in Russia. Unsurprisingly, by 2024, millions of Moldovans, more than a third of the population, will have obtained Romanian passports this way, including Sandu. In fact, Sandu has said that if a referendum on reunification with Romania were to be held in the future, she would vote for Moldova to merge with Romania. As mentioned earlier, Moldova chose to merge with Romania 100 years ago. Ultimately, if the Transnistria issue cannot be resolved, reunification with Romania may become a discretionary option for Moldova. San wants Moldova to remain a sovereign nation. However, if that is impossible, reunification with Romania is a viable plan. She told RFI and Deutsche, "We can join the European Union together with Romania." And this is not something we alone are thinking. The majority of the Moldovan people support EU integration. There are also those who support integration with Romania. Now we are working hard to make Moldova part of the European Union, and we hope this scenario will work. If for some reason it doesn't work, we will of course consider other options. Our most important goal is to protect peace in Moldova and keep Moldova part of the free world. From Tokyo's perspective, this is not just a story about a small part of Eastern Europe. It is a boldly labeled valley. If a great power can hand out passports, leave troops in segregated areas, and then claim the right to intervene for protection, then all democratic nations subjected to co-oppression should pay attention to it. High intelligence restraining sovereignty and emphasizing clear ties with free nations is not ideological ornamentation. It is a basic insurance policy for any country that has actually called itself the manual of provincialist pressure. Meanwhile, the Kremlin, once again presenting itself as a firefighter, is quietly harboring a sense of gasoline. Is it subtle? Not at all. How many transfers will go along with Putin's proposal? Will they be incorporated into Russia's war personnel system like SANSEMs? And what will become of Moldova's hopes for the EU? Time will tell. For now, the situation is clear, that things are escalating rapidly. Of course, we will continue to keep a close eye on this issue and unravel it as it happens. That's all for today's broadcast. We look forward to receiving your valuable feedback. Thank you for watching.